The shriek cut through late morning in Flaxborough's Memorial Hall. Mrs. Vine, chair of the Ladies' Horticultural Committee and not known for public outbursts, was discovered clutching the velvet dahlia cup, smeared in a curious shade of indigo and missing its prized inscription. Around her, rows of trembling petunias trembled all the more, for the cup had been meant for Mrs. Blenkinsop, whose own entry, Moonlight Sonata, lay trampled under what one could only describe as the tread of a sensible shoe. "Flaxborough flower shows don't usually require first aid," muttered Mr. Hargrove, the stationer, extracting a crumpled handkerchief from his top pocket as if it might repel scandal. "You see what happens when outsiders judge," wailed Mrs. Blenkinsop, looking briefly at her trampled bloom, and then rather longer at Mrs. Vine. At the back, Reverend Smollett attempted control. "If we could all pray for calm," he began, but his voice was drowned out by Mrs. Pinchbright's whispered prophecy, "Cups cursed. Ask Mrs. Vine's late husband." As if summoned by discord, Fred the caretaker appeared and offered, "Not the first time they've mixed up prizes round here. Remember the plum jam debacle?" before vanishing behind a rack of unsteady gladioli. From various corners voices rose in a quick succession of Flaxborough gossip. "It's sabotage, mark my words. Blenkinsop's always been after the silverware. The vicar's niece was seen near the dahlias. She shouldn't have been there either. Did you see the shoe? No one around here wears grey soles. The cup's been missing all morning. They're probably weighing scales in the kitchen with it. They say Mrs. Vine locks her greenhouse at night. Odd, that." Under the swirl of speculation, a peculiar detail lingered, a torn price tag, carefully snipped from a bouquet and tucked just in front of the trophy. Upon close inspection it read £6.50, far above the market rate for local blooms. Inspector Purbright noted its placement without comment, ensuring Sergeant Love did not see him do so. The hall's atmosphere, already thick with expectation, shifted palpably as the crowd parted for the arrival of Inspector Purbright. Mild spectacles perched at a judicious angle, the detective surveyed the confusion with unhurried interest. He paused by the trampled petunias, considered the indigo-smeared cup, and said, "One hopes it was the judging, not the flowers, that proved fatal to dignity." His remark trickled out, oddly calming, until, abruptly, an anguished voice shouted from the far window, "The judge's tally sheet!" "It's gone." In the hallway, a child's cry echoed. The crowd, now at the point of boiling, surged towards the committee table. Sergeant Love, earnest and already flustered, tried to usher order just as Mrs. Vine fainted, her indigo-smeared fingers clutching at empty air. Behind the committee table, something glinted unseen by all but Purbright. Sergeant Love, having managed to steer the fainted Mrs. Vine onto a borrowed wicker chair, now dabbed her brow with a napkin generously scented with onion sandwiches. The crowd that had surged towards the committee table broke into subsiding eddies, each rippling with what it fancied was the latest truth. All the while, Inspector Purbright glided through the commotion with the unobtrusive gravity of an autumn fog. A fierce, pine-scented whisper found its way to Love from Mrs. Pinchbright, whose prominent red hat quivered with suppressed excitement. "Don't let the cup out of your sight, Sergeant," she insisted, punctuating her warning with a deliberate glare at Mrs. Vine. "She's always been ambitious and locked her greenhouse after dark, she does, and her late husband, bless him, never so much as looked at a flower." Love received this confidence with a nod that suggested he had, in fact, been born to carry out such a sacred trust. He folded the napkin and looked expectantly at Purbright, who was already consulting the trampled petunias, his hands folded behind his back. Meanwhile, mutterings filtered from all corners of Memorial Hall. "Can't say I'm surprised. Anyone who enters a hot water bottle cosy knitted to look like Churchill is capable of anything. I heard it was the verger's son, up past midnight bragging about rare bulbs. That committee hasn't had a proper scandal since the jam-shortening year. She never paid full price for those dahlias, I'll wager. First, the plum jam debacle, now this. Mark my words, the Gazette will love it. A less audible thread of conversation twisted between Mrs. Blenkinsop and her companion, Miss Moxton, whose knowledge of the town's kitchen window habits was near legendary. "The tally sheet is gone," said Blenkinsop, more to herself than to her friend. "Who'd want it, unless there's something on it that shouldn't be seen?" "Or someone with more to hide than dahlias," Moxton replied, eyes fixed on the committee table as if she could will the truth into existence. Behind the rack of gladioli, Fred, the caretaker, gathered up shards of a blue china saucer, talking of the judge's missing tally sheet, floating to him in the air like a bad odour. "Suppose it'll all come down on my head," he muttered, shelving his irritation under a resigned sigh. "Last time I shut those windows, all I found was 2 stray wasps and a copy of Bridal Basket's Quarterly." While Mrs. Vine revived thanks more to indignation than love's clumsy ministrations, the hall's energy condensed once more around the table. Purbright advanced there, surveying the scene through wire-rimmed spectacles and a thin layer of dust motes adrift in the sunlight from the high brown windows. He regarded Mrs. Vine's indigo-smeared hands, Mrs. Blenkinsop's tremulous lips, and Mrs. Pinchbright's unwavering vigilance. There, too, lay the trampled petunias, whose state offered silent testimony to the morning's confusion. Purbright's expression was one of polite interest, as though he were observing a particularly slow chess match rather than a rupture in Flaxborough society. "Madam," he said quietly to Mrs. Vine, "might I trouble you for a brief account of where you have been this morning?" And indeed, with whom? She flinched at the question, blinking twice before righting herself. The cup was missing from the cabinet after breakfast. "Well, I searched. I asked Mrs. Blenkinsop if she had it for polishing. She denied it, of course, and then— I don't recall much before my faint. It was an unconvincing performance, all perfumed nerves and strategic amnesia." Purbright turned elsewhere. "Mrs. Blenkinsop, did you notice anything untoward before the ceremony?" The widow shook her head, but then hesitated. "Not until I saw Mrs. Vine hurrying from the kitchen, petunias brushed aside and her shoes quite grey." Sergeant Love perked up. "Grey, you say? Can't have many of those about. Got to be someone from away, I'd guess." Purbright made a small, non-committal sound, pocketing the loose tag, which he now noted as slightly crisp at the edge, as if hastily detached. Turning to the crowd, he called out gently, "If any of you happen to see the tally sheet, or indeed know where it is, now might be a very convenient time to mention it. It would save Sergeant Love both effort and the local constabulary's supply of tea." A general rustle wandered through the hall, but the answer was silence, or rather, silences layered with glances. The Reverend Smollett covered his cough with a hymn booklet. Miss Moxton bit her lip. Several townsfolk studiously rearranged vases, as if menaced by feelings of civic guilt. It was at precisely that moment that Mrs. Gedgeth, sub-postmistress, and famed for the accuracy of her hearsay, marched in with a brown envelope. "I found this in the mailbox." No stamp. "Addressed to be opened by the show committee only." I thought it peculiar, considering the weather. Love, nearly fumbling the envelope in his eagerness, opened it to reveal an empty tally sheet. Purbright delicately turned over the paper and found, scribbled in the lower corner, the phrase "Truth needs water, not polish." "What do you make of it, sir?" Love asked, baffled, as Mrs. Vine let out another frail moan. "Perhaps," Purbright mused, "sometimes appearances are washed rather than wiped. Before Love could process this, Mrs. Pinchbright broke the hush with a furious exclamation. "My carnations! Someone has moved them!" She darted towards her exhibit, followed at speed by half the curious onlookers. There, resting amid the ruffled white petals, lay a slip of green felt matching the judge's hat misplaced earlier. Last seen with Councillor Chubb, muttered to someone in the crowd. A barely audible undercurrent ran through the onlookers. Chubb's not been right since his car got towed. Why would a judge's hat lining end up with the carnations unless... All this for a cup. Next year we'll all wear gloves. Purbright retrieved the felt, glancing subtly at the way Mrs. Vine gripped the arms of her chair, knuckles blanched. Meanwhile, Miss Moxton's eyes never left Councillor Chubb, who had gone remarkably pale and was now whispering to a portly man from the Chamber of Commerce. Sergeant Love scribbled hastily. "Odd, all this hat business," he said. "You suppose it's connected, sir?" "There is, as always, a certain symmetry," Purbright replied, his tone as light as mingled tea and milk. As the last of the exhibits was redirected and the committee struggled to maintain composure, Purbright turned back to the crowd. "I would like to speak with Councillor Chubb, if he can spare a moment from horticultural supervision." An uncertain hush fell as Chubb, tugging his lapels and glancing sidelong at his colleagues, edged forward. The hint of mystery deepened a new thread woven through the day's bewilderments. Yet even as this exchange transpired, Fred the caretaker, finding a crumpled carnival programme beneath the trampled petunias, frowned, memories of last year's confusion resurfacing. It bore unfamiliar initials scrawled beside the children's section. His lips pursed, but he tucked the programme into his overalls, undecided whether mischief or mere muddle was to blame. The afternoon sunlight faded, shrouding Memorial Hall in that doubtful half-light particular to Flaxborough, neither promising nor entirely damning, but always suggestive. By late afternoon, Flaxborough's Memorial Hall resembled a battlefield, with quivering posies and porcelain teacups held as shields against unspoken accusations. If the initial scandal had roused curiosity, the subsequent developments spread a feverish unease that no amount of herbal tea could suppress. The committee, huddled and pink-faced, made frantic adjustments to their schedules. The children's section was postponed, the tombola abandoned as suspect, and Mrs. Pinchbright's carnations were now cordoned off as evidence, the judge's hat lining tucked into Sergeant Love's battered notebook. Inspector Purbright, ever the picture of humility amid a crisis, addressed the crowd with an air of gentle amusement. "There is a question about the integrity of the proceedings," he mused aloud, "but it seems the only thing thoroughly arranged today is confusion." Among those gathered, Mrs. Blenkinsop sat with her knees pressed against one another, so tightly that her sensible shoes bowed outward. Her friend Miss Moxton whispered behind a paper plate, "20 years I've watched these flower shows and never such a to-do. It'll be Mrs. Vine for certain. Those hands of hers are never clean." At the periphery, Fred the caretaker eyed the carnival programme he'd unearthed. The initials beside the children's section E.F. were unfamiliar, and he considered who among the regulars took any interest in the youngest exhibitors. A shuffling sound drew his attention to a pair of committee members, Mr. Hargrove and Councillor Chubb. Deep in murmured conversation. Councillor Chubb stiffened when Purbright approached. "If I might trouble you, Councillor, about the committee's judging arrangements, a misplaced item, a hat, or anything unusual enter your notice this morning?" Purbright's tone was clinical yet kind. It invited confidence but promised no refuge from contradiction. Chubb wiped his brow. "The hat must have slipped off when I stood to announce the Dahlia class. Didn't notice until Mrs. Pinchbright started up with her fuss. I did hear something odd, though it sounded like the back door just after we announced the cup. Only judges and committees were meant to be backstage." Purbright nodded, then queried, "Did anyone else seem anxious or preoccupied?" A glance flashed across the room, lingering on Mrs. Vinegar Lipstick, now fading near the corners, and Mr. Hargrove, who, for all his pride in precise stationery, was fidgeting with the tape dispenser as if it were a viper. Sergeant Love, hoping for clarity, sidled up to Purbright. "Lot of folk whispering about the price tag, sir. They say it's not just about cheating. It could be someone showing off, buying flowers rather than growing them." A chorus of speculation swirled about sacrilege buying at Jarman's when the fields are full. That price, though, it's nearly twice as much as last year's. Wouldn't surprise me if Mrs. Vine hasn't tended her plot since Easter. Perhaps someone planted the tag to embarrass her. No secret. Chubb's brother imports from the city. Purbright guided Love to a quiet corner. The absence of the tally sheet, the misplaced hat lining, and the price tag are each minor discords, yet together they form a curious melody. Love, keen and dogged, puzzled over the clues aloud. If the tally sheet was taken, it wasn't to hide a slip in math. Someone wanted it out of sight. But why the empty envelope? Purbright looked thoughtful. If one intends to suppress information, removing but returning a blank sheet is only half a deception. Suppose the real tally remains with someone intent on misdirecting us. At this, Mrs. Gedge, the sub-postmistress, reappeared, arms laden with unopened committee mail. Plenty of notes for the lottery's secretary. "Not all of them friendly, I gather," she commented, passing the stack to Purbright. Among the letters was one laced with dried lavender and signed "A devoted admirer of local excellence." Inside, a cryptic quatrain, "When blooms compete but hearts suspect, one silver cup may both reject. Beware the judge whose lining phrase, the truth's a flower that rarely stays." Sergeant Love blinked at the rhyme. Someone's keen on riddles. Mrs. Blenkinsop, gathering confidence, stood to address the crowd. "I believe an error has plagued our committee, perhaps more than one. Let us, for decency's sake, allow the police to guide us." A murmur of assent, laced with worry, swept the hall. But as the committee prepared to retire for deliberation, Fred stumbled from the back room, found this wedged under the bin. He handed Purbright a faded photograph of a past show marked upon the back in smudged pencil. "For Eva May, all your flowers bloom silver." Purbright's brow furrowed momentarily. "Eva," he repeated, "not Vine, nor Blenkinsop. Miss Moxton, do you know any Avas?" Miss Moxton, delighted to be consulted, nodded quickly. Ava Pettingill, moved west a year ago, used to run the children's section, very particular about rules and trophies, never trusted committee handling. Discussion of Eva Pettingill revived older memories among the crowd. She sued the committee over the delphinium dilemma. Her niece still lives locally and works at the town hall. Rumour was she took a silver spoon with her. Sergeant Love, eager, asked, "You suppose she's come back, sir?" "Unlikely," Purbright said quietly, "but connections linger, like fertilizer, in damp soil." Outside, dusk was folding over Flaxborough, streetlights flickering on with indecisive resolve. Memorial Hall was now a straining canvas of dependencies and suspicion, everyone certain of some hidden truth, but unable to name it. As the deliberations began, Mrs. Vine, steadier now, took up her handbag and strode purposefully out into the car park. Purbright watched her go, absorbing the briskness of her gait as a detail worth preserving. Within, conversation refocused on Councillor Chubb and Mr. Hargrove, whose earlier alliance seemed now less collegial and more conspiratorial. Chubb whispered something, Hargrove responded, and both eyed the police as if fearing both exposure and exoneration. Fred, sensing the tension, cleared his throat. "You'll want to check the rubbish bins in the yard shed. Never know what folk throw out when no one's looking." Purbright offered him a thankful nod. Perspicacious as ever, Fred. Corruption frequently lurks among the potato peelings. While Love prepared for another circuit among suspects and flower arrangements, Purbright returned to the quatrain, rereading its lines under the yellow light. Beware the judge whose lining phrase. The truth's a flower that rarely stays. Observe not only the bloom, he said, almost to himself, but also who chooses to plant it and how. Within minutes, Sergeant Love was questioning Mrs. Pinchbright about her carnations. "When did you last see the hat lining?" he asked. She answered with practised indignation, 10 minutes before the tally sheet went missing. I saw Chubb whispering to Mrs. Vine, and then all of a sudden the lining moved. Never trusted polyester to stay put. Polyester or no, said Love, it seems odd to find it amongst the carnations, unless someone wanted it noticed. Or someone wanted me blamed, Pinchbright retorted sharply. Chubb's been after my seat on the committee all year. At the window the dusk thickened. Inside, the social fractures of Flaxborough widened with every whispered name, every puzzled glance at a price tag, photograph, or cryptic rhyme. As Purbright slipped the photograph into his case, the next scandal-loomed and uncharacteristically nervous Mr. Hargrove was called to announce the evening's charity drawing. In the hush, the numbers on the board flickered, and then, just as he began to speak, the board changed mysteriously. Hymn number 402 now read 404, to several gasps and one muffled cry, "The missing number!" The crowd surged forward and Purbright's eyes narrowed. Hymn number 404, thrown up on the battered wooden board, was not, as several parishioners immediately whispered, part of any published hymnal known in Flaxborough, nor indeed any church in the county. Purbright watched the ripple of confusion that fanned out from the display, gripping the assembled crowd with a force not unlike the sweep of a sudden breeze through the rows of meticulously tended sweet peas. Mr. Hargrove, fidgeting at the lectern with the reserve of a man repeatedly accused of moving set pieces for his own advantage, stammered an apology. "It appears there's been some mistake with the hymn numbers. Please disregard. 402 is what we rehearsed, I assure you, but the moment's oddness would linger." Fred, the caretaker, ever practical and habitually underappreciated, was already by the wall, wobbling the board on its hook. He announced with grave solemnity, "Been stuck something fierce the last 2 weeks. Never jumped 2 numbers, though. Not unless someone fiddled with it." His statement, delivered without embellishment to the nearest 12 onlookers, only deepened the uncertainty. Meanwhile, Sergeant Love glanced at Purbright, a notebook already open, the stub of a pencil quivering in anticipation. "You think this has a bearing, sir?" "Love?" she asked in hushed tones. Purbright answered only with a faint smile and a remark that wandered away before landing. Sometimes the missing is more informative than the found. As people struggled to understand, suspicion began to circle the 404 like a hawk over late-planted beans. Speculation coiled quickly, counsel meddling, always poking about where it doesn't belong. "Last time we had a mix-up, Elsie Pinchbright ended up playing Greensleeves at the memorial. I said it before, ever since Eva left, nothing's been done properly. My Bert says Chubb's never minded a muddle, just as long as someone else gets the blame." The crowd, watchful, suspicious, ready to pounce on either error or duplicity, became more a congregation of wary foxes than of innocent doves. Mrs. Vine, now visibly steady, had returned to the edge of the gathering, her pale gloves clutched between her hands, as if daring anyone to look for so much as a flake of blue dye. Sergeant Love made his rounds among the usual competitors, though his pace slackened when Mrs. Pinchbright fixed him with her basilisk stare. Within this fog of conjecture, Purbright charted a slow, deliberate course. He cornered Fred by the vestry and in a tone as soft as moth wings inquired, "Tell me, Fred, who's had access to this board today?" Fred, startled by both flattery and police interest, recounted, "Just me, the Reverend, and Mr. Hargrove. Miss Moxton dusts here and says numbers should be even, but I haven't seen her near it this afternoon. You want me to check up in the loft? Not just yet, but tell me, was that board always as sticky as you say?" Purbright's gaze was searching but kind. Fred's brow creased. "No, not until last week, when the Chubb boy brought in that can of spray polish. Modern efficiency, he called it. I warned him too, but you know what young folk are like with their improvements." Purbright inclined his head, storing away yet another quietly discordant note amid the gathering cacophony. He made a mental list: a sticky board, a misplaced cup, an errant tally sheet, a price tag, a hat lining, and now a missing hymn. More than any one clue, it was the rhythm of their happening that sang of intention, not accident. A fresh round of muttering rose from the punch table. Mark my words, the Gazette will spin this into a contest rigged by city folk. My cousin's choir in Hexthorpe always double-checks hymn numbers and never trusts a lazy committee, supposed to be a charity draw tonight, but who wants to win with scandal in the air? At that, Purbright's gentle probing turned to Mr. Hargrove, who had resumed fiddling nervously with the tape dispenser. "A difficult afternoon?" Purbright observed mildly. "Did you happen to see anything or anyone out of place behind the lectern when the number changed?" Hargrove shook his head with a shade too much emphasis. "No, nothing, absolutely nothing. Only the council papers and the hymn slips Mrs. Gedge brought me." Though he hesitated, I suppose, well, Councillor Chubb did lean over just before it flicked. The undercurrent seized on this like a duck to water. I knew it. Chubb's always poking at things he shouldn't. Serves him right for fiddling with hymn numbers. Next, he'll be choosing winners by lucky dip. You mark me, this is all about the committee elections. Sergeant Love, with the slow doggedness of a man who believes in the temporal virtue of making lists, sidled once more to Purbright. We've got Vine with the price tag, Blenkinsop losing the cup, Chubb accused of hat lining, and now him meddling. Where do we even start? Purbright allowed himself a slightly longer pause. Start, perhaps, where intentions overlap. Disruptions are rarely solitary unless by design. He surveyed the thinning crowd. Several were sneaking glances at the committee, whose deliberations had turned pointed and shrill. Mrs. Vine, attempting dignity, gave the impression of someone plotting furtive getaways. Mrs. Blenkinsop seemed to be rehearsing a public apology. Chubb pursed his lips and glared at the hymn board as if it were a rival at cards. Fred, now in deep communion with the stepladder, disappeared towards the loft, muttering all the way about modern mistakes and ancient dust. Purbright's gaze lingered on the crowd, watching for that moment when feigned innocence gave way to nervous adjustment of shirt cuffs, handbags, hats, and even the adjustable heel of Mrs. Pinchbright's sensible shoes. By now the tea-urn had been polished clean, the treacle tart judiciously divided, and the coterie of gossipers huddled in increasingly conspiratorial circles. The town's gossip grapevine raised further questions. Did you see the state of those carnations? Someone's been at them, I'll bet. Chubb never stood out for honesty. Reckon Fred's the only honest man left. He's got no reason to lie. As night gathered outside and the lamplight shone on relic blooms and disturbed egos, Purbright felt a shift in the air, tangible as a cold draught under a closed door. Tidying his notes, he resolved to follow up on Mrs. Vine's errant walk and revisit Ava Pettingill's connection, small clues waiting beneath layers of pettiness and pride. Sergeant Love, meanwhile, closed his notebook and announced, "If there's a pattern in all this, sir, it's a pattern of confusion." Purbright smiled. "Often, Sergeant, confusion is a veil draped over the simple." We'll watch what moves when folk believe they aren't observed. The next step is in the patient stitch of ordinary detail. As the church clock struck 8, the show committee prepared to announce a revised plan for the charity draw, promising to restore decorum to the shattered day. The crowd gathered once more beneath the flickering lights, unaware that the real shuffling was yet to come. The reassembled crowd stood firm as Mr. Hargrove tapped the microphone for the charity draw, his fingers trembling like a man tuning a radio to catch the shipping forecast in a storm. Townsend Memorial Hall buzzed with anticipation and unease, both knotted tightly between the pale bunting and the battered card tables. Each face, whether lined with age or the surprise of recent scandal, strained toward the lectern. Even Mrs. Pinchbright, who never missed her 8:30 omnibus, appeared to have settled in for the night. The committee lined up with forced smiles. Mrs. Blenkinsop clung to the apron of dignity, one hand hovering anxiously at her throat, eyes swivelling as if watching for the next social tremor. Councillor Chubb appeared less like a public servant and more like a man who'd lost something vital in the undertow of local politics. In the back row, Mrs. Vine was composed once more, her gloves pulled on with surgical precision, as if convinced the hush would vindicate her at last. Mr. Hargrove cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen, we beg your indulgence for the delays. The draw will proceed, and the cup, when found, will be restored to its rightful owner." He looked directly at Mrs. Blenkinsop, who attempted a self-deprecating smile and failed. Purbright watched the subtle choreography, a sidelong glance here, a clenched jaw there. He found himself focusing on the unguarded Fred, returning discreetly from the vestry with the faint aroma of mildew and contrition, and Miss Moxton quietly hugging the hymn book to her chest. Even Love, whose earnest frown worked the clues as doggedly as a terrier, kept a running commentary in whispered tones behind Purbright's left shoulder. The charity draw began. Mr. Hargrove rustled through envelopes, calling out names as the prizes, chutney jars, tea bags, and a lurid handmade cushion found shaky hands and the odd forced cheer. The festive moment was punctuated by Mrs. Vine, whose slip of paper was read aloud, "Mrs. Vine voucher for Jarmin's florist." A murmur circled the room, briefly glancing off the subject of whether that could constitute a conflict of interest. "She'll be entering bought blooms for certain next time," someone said sotto voce, the barb half swallowed in wry laughter. Fred quietly produced the carnival programme he'd rescued from the trampled petunias, offering it to Purbright with a grumble. "Never seen those initials before, Sir E.V., but the children's section's been a muddle since Ava left. I found it where the tally sheet ought to have been. I'd wager that's not a chance." Purbright acknowledged this in his usual polite drift, always present yet never imposing. "Thank you, Fred. Curiosity is a virtue seldom practiced." In the lull of the last prize, Councillor Chubb edged away from the committee. Purbright intercepted him by the window, his tone conversational. "An eventful evening, Councillor. You seem troubled." Chubb's face twitched. "Who wouldn't be, with this level of scrutiny?" "I only want the show to reflect Flaxborough's best. You spoke with Mrs. Vine just before the cup was discovered, didn't you?" Chubb hesitated, glancing at his shoes. "Yes. She asked if I'd check the tally sheet. Claims she heard rumours/sabotage, you know, but I barely saw it. I was distracted by all the noise backstage. About the hymn board, did you change it or see anyone?" Chubb's lips pressed together. "No, never touched it. Fred's responsibility. I was looking for my hat." Purbright watched, recording the anxiety rather than the words. "Of course. Let me know if you recall anything else." A new shiver of gossip flitted through. If Chubb had the tally, why hand it off? Something to hide? Wouldn't be the first time a cup's gone walkabout. The old one vanished in '68, never came back. Mrs. Vine's winning streak is unnatural anyway. Sergeant Love conferred with Miss Moxton, who, under the pretext of checking hymnals, offered, "You know, Sergeant, there's been talk. Eva's niece, Sally, has been helping in the hall evenings, moving things about after hours. Since the leaks in the roof, she's had keys." Sergeant Love took this in, scribbling, "Sally Pettingill lives above the fishmongers, doesn't she?" "Yes, and she's competitive. Last year she complained bitterly that the children's section was an afterthought, said the town clings to old feuds. By the sweet peas Mrs. Pinchbright was expounding to all who would listen. Too many prizes handed to beginners. Awards mean less these days. I wouldn't be surprised if certain committee members have encouraged inappropriate entries just to undermine my record." Purbright's attention shifted. The recorded tensions between Pinchbright and Vine had become a fixture of local folklore, but now, with Sally Pettingill's discreet navigation around town feuds, the field of potential mischief-makers widened. The old photograph for Eva, the missing tally, all ticked towards unseen hands. As the draw concluded, Mrs. Blenkinsop, voice trembling, addressed the assembly. "Perhaps a committee member took the cup or a hanger-on. I trust the inspector will discover the truth." This statement, couched in measured dignity, did not hide the hopeful inflection, the same hope that glimmers in gamblers and children, that fate will, for once, deliver justice. Purbright turned it gently in his mind before returning to Fred and Sergeant Love. "There was a period when the tally sheet, the cup, and the board were unattended, correct?" he asked. Fred nodded. "From the end of the judging to the opening of the show, yes. Anyone could have slipped in during the fuss with the rainwater coming under the west door." Sergeant Love, shaking his head, said, "No shortage of folk with the Opportunity Committee, helpers, or even old Sally if she's got keys." "That narrows it," Purbright replied, "if not by much." Just then, a commotion by the cloakroom burst the hush with a shriek, followed by the crash of an umbrella stand. All eyes turned as young Sally Pettingill stumbled out, face white, shaking a dust-smudged envelope and stammering, "This was hidden behind the heaters. I only wanted a place for my bag, I swear." Purbright approached, as calm as a summer dusk. He took the envelope and examined the calligraphy. In one corner, "For the true winner, only reveal if others fail." Inside was the missing tally sheet, daubed faintly in indigo with a floral thumbprint, pristine and damning. A gasp rippled through the committee, and at last suspicion settled with real weight. As Mrs. Vine slumped into her chair again, all eyes fixed on her, certain, as Flaxborough ever was, that scandal always found its way home. A hush as profound as the fold between hymn verses fell, broken only by Mr. Hargrove hastily stacking envelopes and Mrs. Vine's uneven breathing. Inspector Purbright reached for the indigo-stained tally sheet, holding it up with the careful detachment of a man handling freshly unearthed fossils. The assembled Flaxborough dignitaries stared, expressions moving between vindication and dismay, each recalculating their standing amid this latest embarrassment. Sergeant Love claimed the envelope, examining the indigo thumbprint with the same scrutiny usually reserved for odd tea stains in the constabulary kitchen. "Indigo, the same as the cup, sir." He said it in a stage whisper, his voice both awed and accusatory. Sally Pettingill, her knuckles white on her bag strap, glanced at Purbright, pleading, "I just found it. I've nothing to do with whatever's happened." Purbright, without accusation, nodded. "Sometimes, Miss Pettingill, surprise is the truest measure of innocence. Gossip at the edge of the crowd spread as quickly as the fragrance from Mrs. Pinchbright's carnations." Her aunt always said Sally had quick fingers. "No need for keys if you're the clever sort, and that die's a devil to shift. Vinny's been tampering, I'll wager." Mrs. Vine, pale but unyielding, summoned her wits. "Inspector, I purchase flowers only when there is a shortage, never for competition. I left my gloves on the committee table. Yes, anyone might have borrowed the indigo. The logic might have satisfied a less practised eye, but Purbright's gaze lingered. Gloves have their uses, Mrs. Vine, but evidence often prefers what hands leave behind. Councillor Chubb, suddenly bold, interjected, "Let's settle this." We all saw Vine near the cup. Her hands were stained, after all. Before Purbright could reply, Fred shuffled forward. "Excuse me, all? Found something else behind the radiator, wrapped in a hymn slip. Looks familiar." He unfurled a crumpled tag, the price scrawled in heavy ink, £6.50. The children's section lists prices. The judge said all tags were accounted for, but these are from the grown-ups' bouquets. Miss Moxton piped up. Eva Pettingill always had this habit. She'd move price tags about to see who was honest, part of her educational mission. If Sally's helping, maybe she was following old rules. Sally blinked, trying to speak. "Yes, I tidied after the children's display. Swapped tags so everyone got a chance. But I had no reason for the cup or the tally." A fresh wave of conjecture bobbed through the crowd. "Played right into Vinnie's hands, I'd say." "Could be Pinchbright. She's desperate for her 5th blue ribbon. Councillor Chubb sets too much store by chaos, keeps him in committee business. Sergeant Love tallied up motives and mishaps on a borrowed raffle ticket. We've got Vinnie with gloves and dye, Chubb with meetings and missing hat, Sally with misplaced tags, and Pinchbright with carnations to defend." Purbright nodded gently, letting suspicion simmer. "There's virtue in patience, Sergeant." As the quarrel grows louder, truth draws nearer. At that very moment the atmosphere snapped. Mrs. Pinchbright, cheeks ablaze, pointed towards Vine. She always said a genuine winner needn't decorate her hands blue. I say it's a practice run gone wrong. Mrs. Vine responded with icy composure. Better a bit of dye than a cemetery of uprooted carnations. The tension shattered as Fred's voice rose, surprisingly firm. "Shows these days are more scandalous than shows. If you want to order, fix the locks and trust the flowers. That's what I say." Purbright caught the exchange, observing the rhythm of defensiveness. In the commotion, Sally quietly slipped beside Miss Moxton, who offered tacit comfort with a gentle pat. The crowd, momentarily disarmed, gave ground, though the current of accusation stubbornly kept its direction. Sergeant Love, reviewing his notes, found a pattern. This business with dye, if someone used Mrs. Vine's gloves, she'd be blamed. Sally admitted to handling tags, but the tally sheet didn't belong in her keeping. Only someone versed in committee routine would know how to plant it, someone who moves easily behind the scenes and in public. Purbright gave a rare satisfied nod. "Excellent, Sergeant. Watching those minor crises often masks strategic minds." Mr. Hargrove coughed. "There's something else, Inspector. Mrs. Blenkinsop called me back to rearrange the entries after the rain. The cup was missing before she notified the committee." All eyes shifted to Mrs. Blenkinsop, usually demure and passive. She stiffened, cheeks white around the lips. "I had asked Fred to check the kitchen. Humidity plays havoc with dahlias. I thought the cup was there for safety. But I never touched it." Purbright considered. "Let's review." The cup vanished during confusion. Dye appeared on the tally sheet, and cup tags were swapped by Sally. After cleaning, gloves were left unattended, and a pattern of minor sabotage was hidden among major drama. Pinchbright snorted. It's hard to sabotage just some people with too much ambition and not enough talent. But tempers had cooled. The game, for now, was with Purbright, who, as dusk crept further across the bunting and carnations, took stock of the stubborn, proud faces, Vine calculating her words, Blenkinsop stiff with worry, Pinchbright itching for vindication, Chubb hiding behind committee rules, and Sally frightened perhaps more by the town than by the scandal. Purbright softly announced, "We will gather those most involved, Vine, Blenkinsop, Pinchbright, Chubb, Sally, and Fred. I expect full honesty." Each clue seems trivial until woven together. The crowd, relieved by structure, retreated to coffee urns and doorways. As the selected group drifted to the committee table, heads bowed in reflection and resentment. Flaxborough's evening began to turn from farce to reckoning, a town assembled at the point where satire tips into truth. The selected group congealed around the committee table, their faces mapped with worry, irritation, and, for Sally, youthful uncertainty. Mrs. Vine tweaked her gloves with the meticulousness of a stage actor. Mrs. Blenkinsop settled into her seat with the solemnity of a church pillar. Mrs. Pinchbright pressed her bag against tightly folded arms, prepared for rhetorical combat. Chubb's distinguished air buckled slightly under expectation. Fred lingered just outside the circle, wary of being nominated scapegoat again. Sergeant Love produced his notebook, the last page already filled with overlapping motives and mistakes. He glanced at Purbright, who surveyed the assembly with an expression pitched between sympathy and quiet amusement. The hall itself seemed to shrink around them, its usually bright banners faint in the twilight, gossipers now huddled at a respectful distance, all ears and half whispers. Purbright cleared his throat softly. Now let us consider what ordinary people might think. A cup, a tally sheet, some die, a price tag, a hat lining, and more than one old grudge. Events that seem random often come from need, not design. Need to win, to be vindicated, to correct a slight. Sometimes the straightest route to truth is the one most trampled by pride. Some tension fled the room. Vine, with brittle dignity, announced, "I have entered this show for 19 consecutive years. I do not stoop to trickery. Gloves stained by accidents, but if dying were a crime, there would be fewer handkerchiefs in Flaxborough." Mrs. Pinchbright, as if on cue, retorted, "If only there were prizes for pomposity. No one has forgotten the jam debacle, Vine." Her words hung in the gloom, attracting nods from the corners. Mrs. Blenkinsop, her voice a dry reed, murmured, "I moved the cup for safety, not secrecy." The Petunia incident was regrettable, but not malign. Chubb shifted. "The vote last spring irritated many. I won't deny Mrs. Pinchbright deserves respect, but her campaign for stricter oversight made enemies. Not all sabotage is obvious." Sally, cheeks pink, kept her eyes on the table. "My aunt trained me to be thorough. I swapped the tags, hoping for fairness, but when the cup vanished and the tally sheet appeared with Dywell, I panicked. I cleaned, tidied, and tried to restore order. Maybe I made things worse." Fred, blunt as only an unpaid caretaker can be, muttered, "People see sabotage everywhere but the bins." He gestured towards the jumble of hymn slips and stray carnations. "Find truth among rubbish, that's my view." Purbright studied faces in turn. Let us look at patterns, not panic. Who was in the hall when the cup disappeared? Vine committee and helpers. Mrs. Blenkinsop and I had left momentarily. Sally and Fred were nearby. Blenkinsop, I locked the side door, but Fred helped move exhibits. Pinchbright was arranging carnations and Chubb was fussing at the sound system. Chubb, Mrs. Vine asked after the tally. Fred was in and out. Sally moved between the children's area and main table. Love interjected, "Did anyone see the cup after the children's section closed?" Fred scratched his head. "I put it on the table at 6:30, ready for judging, then adjusted the hymn board. The cup looked fine. Sally, I saw Mrs. Vine fuss with gloves after the children's display, but the cup was there. When I returned to swap tags, it was gone." Pinchbright, clearly mistrustful, offered, "A show of hands might help, Inspector. Sometimes motive lives in the margins." Purbright smiled gently. "Perhaps, Mrs. Pinchbright, but margins are thick in Flaxborough." Through the window, a passing car played the BBC News theme. It was the only sound of the wider world's daily worries, and global events shrunk beside this civic drama. Inside, the committee was a cold constellation, each disputant blinking in their orbit. In this imperfect stillness, Purbright mused aloud. Something led to these disruptions, a catalyst subtle enough to escape direct notice. If motives overlap and feuds persist, so does opportunity. The odd placement of the tally sheet and indigo thumbprint signal not carelessness, but intent. And if a helper, trained by an older era, swapped price tags, perhaps someone else decided a lesson on honesty should extend to committee pride. Mrs. Blenkinsop's composure wavered. I never meant harmony to keep peace. But when Sally said her aunt's rules made fairness, I presumed those days were nicer. Maybe I was naive. Pinchbright laughed, sharp as glass. Shows are won with grit, not nostalgia. Whoever handled the tally wanted a scandal, a story better than a crate of ribbons. Fred cleared his throat. Routing round suspicion never helps. I saw Sally, Vine, and Pinchbright by the cup. Never saw Blenkinsop near, but the main table was covered in exhibits and hymn slips all day. Sergeant Love scribbled, then looked at Purbright, who seemed to intercept the rising tension like a conductor holding a note. "Thank you, Fred." Purbright then asked, softly but directly, did anyone see indigo dye before the cup was handled? Glances exchanged, finally Sally answered, "After tidying, I saw the dye bottle under the table. Could anyone's children use it for crafts?" Purbright nodded. He surveyed the group one last time, each suspect tilting toward guilt and innocence in the same moment. Mrs. Blenkinsop, subdued, asked, "Are you saying more than one hand was involved?" With his quiet detachment, Purbright replied, "That is so often the case, madam. The web is never woven from a single thread." The committee breathed as if air had just returned. Mrs. Vine's expression for the first time that evening softened. Sally managed a wobbly smile at Fred, who handed her the hymn slip like a peace offering. The church clock struck 9, reverberating over petunias, carnations, and cups, as Purbright's mind turned not to blame, but to connection, and to the next public event that would inevitably cast the drama in sharper relief. Night pressed close against Memorial Hall, outlining Flaxborough's ancient roof tiles in a silver drizzle, but the investigation pressed on beneath the humming fluorescent bulbs. With the formalities of the committee's inner circle complete, a new phase began, one where past alliances and minor slights formed the tangled, shifting landscape of suspicion and defense. Sergeant Love, energized by the uncomfortable proximity of the suspects, hovered like a diligent sheepdog without a flock. Purbright, meanwhile, retreated to the margin of the hall, blending into the background as easily as a well-worn settee. Outside the makeshift conference, townsfolk gathered in huddles along the vestibule, voices pitched just loud enough for everyone to overhear snatches and speculate anew. "I told you Chubb was thin-skinned. Did you see his face when Vine spoke up? They say Fred had the cup last and the blue dye too, but he wouldn't dare. Sally's always friendly, but she's got her aunt's stubbornness. Petting ills, don't forget. None of them wanted a scandal. That's why it's gone so spectacularly wrong." Within the room, Purbright quietly observed the shifting allegiances. Mrs. Blenkinsop and Mrs. Vine, once rivals for civic virtue, now appeared united by common anxiety, conferring in whispers both anxious and accusing. Mrs. Pinchbright, left deliberately alone, watched them with the ferocity of a cat denied her favourite window ledge. Chubb, whose role as peacemaker never suited him, now paced between windows and display tables, fretting his council badge like a vicar mislaid from the pulpit. Fred and Sally unpacked hymn slips, setting them in order to restore some trace of routine to the disrupted community life. Each moment, however ordinary, seemed to reassert the hall's old rhythms, a fleeting sense of normality in a town unsettled by too much transparency. Sergeant Love moved among the supporting cast, interviewing Mrs. Gedge, the vicar, and various regulars from the WI. His style was plain, earnest, and free of the inspector's tendency to prod gently at pride. More than once he heard about Sally's late nights tidying, Fred's reliability, or the older committee women's habit of closing ranks at the first sign of scandal. "It's all small grudges and big memories," Mrs. Gedge volunteered, mouth deep in a mug of strong tea. "Last year's seeds planted this year in suspicion. You'll not sort Flaxborough's mess with fingerprints." Back at the committee table, the dispute over moral standing simmered afresh. Mrs. Pinchbright opened hostilities. "It all comes down to boundaries. I won my first ribbon at 14 and never needed to move a tag, let alone steal a cup." Mrs. Blenkinsop's tone was sweeter, but edged. "You also had 6 aunts on the committee, Edith." "Influence is convenient when you wield it." Pinchbright bristled. "Maybe if you'd spent less time counting votes and more time weeding, you'd have won more than a single commendation." Chubb attempted to intervene, failing with both volume and charm. "That's enough. The only way to fix this is together. We're making ourselves a laughing-stock worse than the jam debacle, if possible." Fred, never one to let social manoeuvring keep him from a good grumble, muttered, "Best thing would be to lock all the doors for a week. Let the place air outlet folk cool down." Sally, who had remained silent, now spoke up. If the tally sheet was placed for blame, someone wanted not just a winner, but a scandal. My aunt said the same during the delphinium dilemma. Keep your eyes on the root, not the bloom. Purbright surveyed this exchange without comment, observing not the bickering itself, but who was watching, who interrupted, and who bristled when their past was invoked. His mind tallied the grudges and pride, each piece of social scar tissue almost as diagnostic as Mrs. Vine's errant gloves. As tempers cooled, Sergeant Love returned with his notebook, lines groaning from conjecture and confession. He addressed the gathering. "It's become clear most had opportunity, but fewer motives. The tags handled by Sally could easily have been borrowed to confuse. The die was accessible, but only the committee and helpers knew its hiding place. And the tally? That's no child's play. It needed someone who knew not just the rules, but also the weaknesses." Chubb, suddenly anxious, blurted, "Do you think the cup itself was merely a diversion?" He looked between Purbright and the rest, as if torn between accusation and self-preservation. Purbright's gaze flickered. Often the boldest theft is not of things, but of attention, but not all who create confusion are architects of malice. Mrs. Vine, lifting her chin, dared, "If you mean me, Inspector, say it. I have nothing to hide." Sergeant Love, backing his notes, replied, "We're not ready to blame. But the gloves that die the timeline all hinge on who left the main table unattended. Most likely, the true saboteur counted on old habits to mask the trick." Sally nodded, quiet but firm. The hall's always busy. If someone set out to discredit Vine or Chubb or my aunt's memory, it would only take a minute and a little nerve. Fred agreed through a grumble. "Once I found a tart crust under the choir stall from Whitson of 92. Some things and some grudges linger." As if on cue, the main doors banged open, and Mrs. Vine's husband's old umbrella, kept religiously at the hall for 20 years, tumbled inside, caught on a gust. The oddness caused a brief hush, broken only when Mrs. Blenkinsop, almost to herself, muttered, "He would never have let a thing go missing, not without a fuss." Purbright at last re-entered the heart of things, remarking gently, "Sometimes it's not just about the prize or the blame, but whose absence leaves the greatest mark." His words, seemingly enigmatic, pricked each conscience around the table. The meeting, in its own fraught way, drew to a close. Outside, laughter echoed from the shelter of the bus stop, and in the gloom, Mrs. Pinchbright moved to comfort Sally, whose nerves, like the rest of Flaxborough's, were stretched but momentarily unbroken. And as midnight threatened, Purbright resolved that the next public face-off, the last set piece, would finally lay bare the roots of so many intersecting disappointments and schemes. By morning, Memorial Hall bore a frazzled calm, the scent of yesterday's carnations lingering beneath the sharper aroma of strong coffee and civic embarrassment. Flaxborough's market town bustle resumed, albeit with a twitchy wariness that was not entirely attributable to the autumn chill or the pervading opinion that scandal, once loosed, could never be wholly returned to its tether. The events of the previous evening reverberated through the town with fresh force, as relatives, acquaintances, and afterthoughts came forward, bearing theories, facts, and a few indignant grievances. Gossip travelled by foot and phone. My cousin at the council, said Chubb, was seen near the stationer's at dawn. Blame Vine if you like, but her geraniums never missed once in 10 years. Pinchbright knows more than she's always said. Sally's been at the Keys again. Pettingill rules, I call it. Inside the hall, the committee reconvened under the heavy suggestion of necessity. Mrs. Blenkinsop arrived first, her hair set with greater purpose than usual, followed by Sally and Fred, still dusting off yesterday's hymn slips. Mrs. Vine, immaculately presented, made her entrance just as Mrs. Pinchbright and Chubb stepped briskly from opposite sides of the square, each carefully avoiding the other's gaze. Sergeant Love, notebook newly paged and tie slightly crooked, took stock of the ensemble. Inspector Purbright found himself at the window, hands neatly folded, watching the drizzle trace slow arcs against the glass. The committee's anxiety was amplified by the prospect of the day's scheduled event, a public reading of the commemorative programme, with all entrants summoned for a celebration of improvements and honesty in local horticulture. The mayor, a well-meaning man with a fondness for windbreaks and half-completed sentences, had insisted on the ceremony as evidence of Flaxborough's resilience. Chairs scraped, voices mumbled, and as the remaining townsfolk arrived, some for the show, others for a spectacle, Fred signalled for proceedings to begin. The crowd was larger than it had been since the Delphinium dilemma, packed with those eager to measure blame, witness confession, or simply be seen not missing history. Mayor Aldershaw gave his address, invoking tradition and humility, and concluded with an aside to Inspector Purbright. Let's have a clean slate, eh? No more mishaps. The request sounded earnest but helpless. Purbright nodded, then stepped forward, signalling Sergeant Love to stand beside him. I am grateful for the patience of the community. Today's event is for the town, but reflection is for those who sought more than ribbons. Before he could elaborate, Mrs. Pinchbright's daughter, Elsie, rushed in, clutching a file folder, papers spilling at her feet. Someone dropped this by the back door. She thrust it into Purbright's hands. Inside, a set of receipts from Jarman's florist, marked in Mrs. Vine's familiar script, and a fifth blue ribbon, last year's champion. The crowd buzzed. Buying blooms isn't illegal, but it's not the Flaxborough way. She kept the receipts as insurance. Smart or sly, you decide. Pinchbright's ribbons scattered. She'll be furious. Purbright raised a hand, calming the surge of speculation. The integrity of shows rests on tradition, but tradition by itself is not proof of motive or guilt. Receipts may show preparation, but not sabotage. Sergeant Love hustled to the stage as Fred signalled him again. There's something else, sir. He held up a hymnal tucked inside, which was a committee memo, its ink smudged and unmistakably handled. Love reading aloud. Prize will go to a deserving entry. The trophy must shine, not the reputation. Mrs. Blenkinsop, startled, blurted, I wrote that we all want the show to matter. But it's not a confession, Chubb, impatient, cut in. This is all becoming ridiculous. We need facts, not further embarrassment. At that moment, Councillor Chubb's rival, Mr. Hargrove, strode up, agitated. Inspector, you ought to see this. He presented a set of schedules, annotated in neat but biting shorthand, denoting movement of committee members during judging. A pattern emerged Sally near the cup, after Miss Moxton's rearrangements, with Fred supervising, Blenkinsop present, then gone to check dampness, Vine returning with gloves, and Pinchbright fussing over carnations. Purbright reviewed each notation, seeking not the obvious overlay of opportunity, but the deeper pulse of intent. He turned to the audience. Most here had a part direct or indirect. But a scandal seldom requires all hands, only the precise application of knowledge. Who was protected, who was exposed, and who benefited? Sally, nearly in tears, spoke up. I only moved things for fairness. My aunt always said, make every show honest, even if no one thanks you. Fred interjected maybe, maybe not. But the die, the cup, the chaos make it hard to call it an accident. Could be someone meant more than drama. Pinchbright, fire undimmed, said, whoever plotted this knew we'd all jump to guilt. Every year someone says next year will be different. Never is. Mrs. Vine, her voice brittle yet composed, declared, I kept receipts to prove I purchased properly. I do not cheat, but I do not apologize for following rules as they are written. Chubb, still agitated, insisted, a committee divided is a show doomed. If honesty depends on suspicion, we might as well give up the cup forever. As the last statement fell silent, Purbright addressed the crowd. In every mystery, confusion breeds opportunity. Think quietly. Who had the greatest reason to seed disorder? Before anyone could answer, Miss Moxton piped up from the rear. It's clear who wanted the spotlight and who made sure every mishap was observed and every mistake punished. This suggestion, scandalous in its directness, settled with uncomfortable weight on the assembly. Gossip swirled fiercely, but eyes settled on Pinchbright as much as Vine and Blenkinsop, and as much as Sally. Purbright looked at each, measuring response not by speech but in fleeting gestures, the tightening of a jaw, the fluttering fingers, and the old rivalries coalescing in the stillness of public shame. As the crowd shifted uneasily, the sense of impending revelation grew thick and palpable as autumn mist. Inspector Purbright took his place at centre stage as the last of the commemorative event's applause faded to an expectant hush. His calm presence seemed to distill the noise and nerves of Memorial Hall into attentive silence. The ceremony had exposed plenty of receipts tucked into hymnals and committee schedules annotated with far too much candour, but genuine understanding remained elusive. Purbright looked out over the gathered faces, watching as old alliances and fresh offences pulsed in nervous murmurs. He cleared his throat, choosing the moment for a gentle but deliberate test. Flaxborough's pride is its candour. That pride can as easily cloud judgment as illuminate it. He let the words settle before continuing. Let me propose a simple thought. Let every person here imagine the cup could be returned this very moment anonymously, with all suspicion set aside. Would that resolve our scandal, or would some of you wish the storm continued until the proper party is named? A rustle moved through the crowd, a parade of denials, anxious glances, and the peculiar silence that only small towns cultivate when invited to trade speculation for sincerity. Mrs. Pinchbright, perhaps emboldened by fatigue, declared, "Truth is only satisfying when witnessed. A show undone by secrecy can never bloom again." Her cheeks flamed, her voice edged, drawing a fractious chorus of nods. Over by the coats, Mrs. Blenkinsop stiffened. "Not all truths are best aired publicly. she said, quieter but clear. Purbright's gaze was unreadable, yet his next words were spoken with intentional softness. Does anyone wish to relieve the committee of its burden now? The cup itself is a symbolic vessel for pride, tradition, and perhaps embarrassment. The instigator of this confusion may not be the winner on paper, but certainly has mastered the show's old game of shadows. He waited. The crowd had expected an accusation, but what they received was an invitation, a chance to reveal by choice, not by coercion. Sergeant Love distributed slips of paper, each headed, "If you know, say so." He walked among the chairs, collecting faintly trembling sheets, not expecting confession so much as observing who wrote and who handed them over with haste or hesitance. Fred, as always, wrote in stolid capitals. I saw Vine by the cup prior to the tally loss, but so did Chubb. Mrs. Vine submitted a blank sheet. Mrs. Pinchbright wrote a defence of tradition skirting the point. Sally's slip, folded and smudged, simply read, "Sorry if I helped." Purbright tallied the notes without a word, then asked, "Is anyone willing to answer one final question? Are you certain, in your own memory, of every movement you made after the children's section closed yesterday?" Chubb, never comfortable with uncertainty, rattled off his movements, interjecting his civic duties as insulation. Mrs. Blenkinsop had more gaps, nervous sighs punctuating uncertain intervals. Mrs. Vine cited her visit to the vestibule, a detail reinforced by Fred's old umbrella and the mounting conviction she wished to be observed. Sally recounted tidying and swapping tags as Aunt Ava would have done, but not touching the cup. Fred clung to routine, locking back doors, checking bins, and watching the usual fuss. Mrs. Pinchbright, the most practiced, listed her actions with precise times, ending with a pointed claim, "I keep the committee's reputation safe, regardless of whims." Her eyes flitted across the room, settling for the briefest instant on Sally before moving on. Purbright gathered the committee and witnesses, seating them in two concentric rings so no one could see the faces of each other. He then asked the crowd to listen as he addressed the committee, never accusatory, simply narrating. Let us consider this. Indignation drove Mrs. Vine to perfect alibis. Mrs. Pinchbright, by over-documenting, hoped to direct suspicion away from old committee feuds. Sally, practiced in fairness, mistook old lessons for permission, not mischief. Fred's routines concealed nothing but placed him everywhere. Mrs. Blenkinsop handled the cup to mitigate drama, not cause it. Chubb's nervousness revealed opportunity, not necessarily crime. He paused, then delivered his test quietly, but surgically. Consider one more hint. The indigo dye, whoever wielded it anticipated blame, perhaps even sought it. Most dye used here is for crafts. It rarely should end up on a ceremonial cup except by intention or as a lesson. The thumbprint on the tally sheet was deliberate. Ask yourself who most wanted to demonstrate the gap between tradition and candor. Silence. Sally bit her lip. Mrs. Pinchbright's eyes flashed. Chubb nearly stood. Purbright concluded softly. A lesson played out, not out of malice, but habit. The orchestrator juggled clues, price tags to test honesty, receipts for insurance, dye for messages, and the cup simply as a centerpiece. Not a scandal for its own sake, but to force the committee and Flaxborough to reveal itself. Sergeant Love leaned closer, the crowd pressing forward. You know who, sir? Purbright's tone remained gentle. The answer was always in the intent, not the incident. If you desire truth, notice who set the stage, not who stood atop it. As the ceremony wound up, the cup unexpectedly appeared atop the piano, clean, with its inscription restored, resting between two roses of unmistakable indigo hue. A gasp, then chuckle, rippled through the crowd. None claimed it, yet every head turned not to Vine, Chubb, or Sally, but to Mrs. Pinchbright, who blushed but held her ground. Purbright delivered his final line for the evening. Tradition, exposed to light, might finally grow beyond the need for such showy prizes. The hall stood in silence for a full heartbeat, dread and relief mixing in equal measure. A gentle drizzle swept the market square as dawn returned Flaxborough to its regular rhythm. The incident at Memorial Hall, by now labelled the Cup Kerfuffle, in every grocer's queue and at the bar of the Golden Sheaf, demonstrated just how robustly and sometimes absurdly small communities could rally around and against their own. Inspector Purbright, unhurried, seated himself within the same hall, whose banners now drooped, with a melancholy suitable for reflection. Around him, Mrs. Vine, Mrs. Pinchbright, Mrs. Blenkinsop, Chubb, Sally, and Fred sat in scattered chairs, neither victorious nor accused, but nervously expectant as if awaiting exam results. The cup, polished and restored, gleamed serenely on the piano like a relic from a less complicated age. With Sergeant Love beside him, Purbright began in his mildest tone, "Some mysteries require not new evidence, but an honest recounting of the familiar. Here we have not a crime, but a demonstration carefully staged using what every committee knows best: routine, rivalry, and pride." He nodded to Sally. "Your swapping of price tags was not mischief, but a tradition handed down. You believed in fairness, yet old rules made for new confusion when habits outpaced intent." Sally exhaled, uncertain. "I did what Aunt Eva always did. I didn't expect the trouble." "Nor did she," Purbright replied, "but neither she nor you orchestrated the escalation. That used to ensure the children's crafts left no permanent mark, became a message, not an accident. The thumbprint was deliberate. Someone meant for it to be noticed, and not only by the police." Mrs. Vine shifted. "I left my gloves for the committee's use and became a suspect for untidiness rather than treachery." "Why would anyone wish for it?" Purbright smiled gently. "That's the question. What better way to debate tradition than to embroil its vanguard in errant dye? Mrs. Pinchbright, your concern for the committee's reputation saw you documenting times, tallying ribbons, voicing tradition at every turn, but in your campaign to restore order, you inadvertently made yourself the ideal pivot for suspicion." Pinchbright bristled, then relented. "Order matters. If we allow sloppiness or carelessness, the show fails. And therein lay the perfect opportunity," Purbright continued. "The orchestrator must know how to exploit habit, not malice. How, with misplaced price tags and a disputed cup, to prod at Flaxborough's love for tidy endings. The cup went missing, not to vanish, but to appear dramatically indigo, and where no honest hand would place it, unless with a lesson in mind." He turned to Mrs. Blenkinsop and Chubb, whose anxious glances confirmed their preference for the matter being resolved. "Your efforts were defensive, not destructive. You rearranged entries out of concern and confusion, not for scandal. But confusion was all the saboteur sought. From the moment the tally vanished, the stage was set for people to blame their history more than their schemes." Sergeant Love cleared his throat. "So the cup was never really at risk, sir? It was always in play as a sort of bait?" "Exactly," Purbright replied. "The orchestrator, protected by routine, at a moment when Sally, Fred, and the committee were all distracted, moved the cup, stained it, and planted the tally, knowing old feuds would ignite and that accusations would follow the lines of local law, never direct evidence." Pinchbright's lips tightened. "I'm not beyond lessons, Inspector, but I'd never tip my own hand so clumsily." "Indeed," Purbright agreed. "But you, Mrs. Pinchbright, were the intended recipient of the lesson as much as its unwitting accomplice. The indigo roses upon the cup last night, who placed them?" Pinchbright hesitated. "I found them in a vase near the piano after the event." "Precisely where a dramatist would place the final mark," Purbright said. It was Sally's aunt, Ava, whose memory guides these rules, but someone attentive to the politics of the show, not the flowers, used those rules to engineer disruption. An instructive sabotage, not malevolent but carefully calculated to force the committee to interrogate itself. The hall was quiet except for the hum of Fred's kettle in the kitchen. Sally looked up, uncertain. Was it for fairness? Purbright nodded. Yes, not out of spite, but out of the stubborn will to ensure Flaxborough neither collapses under its own pride, nor remains stuck in routine. And so the stage was set, swapped tags, a painted cup, the tally sheet tucked behind the heaters, and the hymn number changed. A drama fit for a town whose greatest fear is the loss of tradition and whose greatest asset is its ability to embrace change, however reluctantly. Mrs. Vine's composure softened for the first time, so no one wins or loses except perhaps old grudges. As it should be, Purbright replied, rising. The cup is returned, the ribbons accounted for, and the tally restored. Progress for Flaxborough is not a clean slate, but a slightly altered one. He looked around with wry affection. Scandal is brief, habit eternal, and truth always laced with tea and ambiguity. This was not a crime, but a chance for clarity, forced upon you by a mind more interested in improvement than victory. Mrs. Blenkinsop smiled. Pinchbright allowed herself to laugh. Chubb relaxed at last. Fred poured tea, and Sally, relieved, received quiet approval from the town's most experienced hands. Memorial Hall, swept and calmed by gentle logic, returned to itself as the market town resumed its rituals, chatting, planting, judging, and gossiping with slightly more caution and slightly less certainty.